Edward VIII was born on the 23rd of June, 1894, during the reign of his great-grandmother, Queen Victoria. He was the eldest child of the then Duke and Duchess of York, the future George V and Queen Mary. At birth, he was third in the line of succession. He went by his last given name, David. David and his younger siblings were brought up by nannies, and his parents were not overly affectionate with their children. However, his parents did love them. One of David's earliest nannies was abusive towards the children, and after her maltreatment of the children was discovered, she was replaced by the loving Charlotte Bill. David was tutored at home by various tutors, and when his parents travelled to the British Empire for 9 months in 1901, after the death of Queen Victoria, David and his siblings stayed with their grandparents, Queen Alexandra and King Edward VII in Britain. At the age of 13, David passed his examination to enter the Royal Naval College and began there in 1907. Following 2 years at the Royal Naval College in Osborne, David moved on to the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth. David was withdrawn from the Naval College and placed aboard the battleship Hindustan as a midshipman. Following this, he entered Magdalene College in Oxford, which he was unprepared for academically. After 8 terms, he left Oxford without any qualifications. David was officially invested as the Prince of Wales on the 13th of July 1911 at Carnarvon Castle in Wales. The ceremony was invented by the Welsh politician David Lloyd George, and he coached David to say a few words in Welsh. During the First World War, David hoped to fight on the front lines, but was refused. Despite this, David witnessed trench warfare and visited the front lines as much as possible. He was popular among veterans of the conflict. David learned how to pilot planes and gained a pilot's license in 1918. In January 1919, David's youngest sibling John died from an epileptic seizure. David was much older than John and hardly knew him, so he did not grieve for his brother's death, as one would expect a brother to. In the 1920s, David represented his father at home and abroad. He gained much public attention for his good looks, rank, and bachelor status. He was incredibly popular. Due to his good looks and charming personality, David had many admirers. Several became his mistresses. One such mistress was Marguerite Alibert, whom he met in 1917. They had a relationship for a year before David broke it off. In 1923, Alibert was acquitted of murder charges after she shot her husband. Efforts were made by the royal household to ensure that David's name was not mentioned in connection to Alibert. Other women David had relationships with included Frida Dudley Ward, Lady Furness, and Wallis Simpson. David's womanizing worried the Prime Minister and the King. George V was disgusted and disappointed in David. David soon became infatuated with a woman known as Wallis Simpson, an American socialite who had been twice divorced. Simpson and David's relationship worsened David's already poor relationship with his parents. On the 20th of January 1936, George V died and David ascended the throne as Edward VIII. During his 11 months as king, David paid little attention to his constitutional duties. The government were reluctant to send confidential papers to David, as they feared David would allow others to read them. David broke with tradition when it came to the coins. When a new monarch comes to the throne, they have their portrait taken and their image is stamped onto coins. Each successive monarch faces the opposite direction to their predecessor on the coins. David insisted that he face left, as his father had, to show off his hair parting. Only a handful of these coins existed. In July 1936, an assassin named Jerome Bannigan attempted to kill David with a loaded gun. David was unharmed and Bannigan was soon arrested. During the autumn of 1936, David and Wallis cruised the Mediterranean, and by October it became clear that David was planning to marry Wallis. In November, David expressed his desire to marry Wallis to the Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin. Baldwin informed him that this was unacceptable in the church and that people would not tolerate Wallis as queen. David proposed an alternative solution. Wallis would not be queen consort, but she would enjoy a lesser title like princess or duchess, and any children they might have would not inherit the throne. This was supported by some senior politicians like Winston Churchill, but ultimately was rejected by the government. Because he was not allowed to marry Wallis, David abdicated on the 11th of December 1936. The following day, David left Britain for Austria. His brother Albert succeeded him as George VI. David would be known only as the Duke of Windsor and reverted back to his princely title and style. David married Wallis on the 3rd of June 1937 in France. The king forbade any members of the royal family from attending, and Wallis was denied the style of Her Royal Highness. This caused lasting resentment from the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. David owned Sandringham House and Balmoral Castle, having inherited them as private properties from George V. George VI bought them from David so that they would stay in the hands of the monarch and the royal family. For years after the abdication, the relationship between the Duke and his family remained strained, and David was not allowed to return to Britain. David and Wallis settled in France. In October 1937, David and Wallis visited Nazi Germany and met Adolf Hitler. This went against the advice of the British government. In the outbreak of war, the Duke and Duchess were brought back to Britain. They eventually returned to France the following year, and when Germany invaded, they fled to Biarritz and then to Spain. In July 1940, they moved to Portugal, and that same month, David was appointed governor of the Bahamas. They travelled there in August 1940 and stayed until 1945. David supported Hitler and had Nazi sympathies. The Marburg files detailed a plot by the Nazis to have the Duke join their side and have him reinstated as king with Wallis as queen. They also had letters written by the Duke to Hitler in which he encouraged relentless bombing of the United Kingdom. These letters were recovered by US troops from Germany in May 1945. After the war, the couple returned to France and remained there for the rest of their lives. Neither held another official role. They effectively became celebrities, hosting parties and travelling between Paris and New York. The Duke and Duchess were not invited to the coronation of Elizabeth II in 1953. Many members of the royal family never forgave Wallis. Queen Mary refused to meet her, and the Queen Mother never forgave her for causing the abdication. In the 1960s, the Duke and Duchess did attend events in the UK. They attended the centenary of Queen Mary's birth in 1967 and the memorial service of the Princess Royal in 1967 also. They refused an invitation to attend the investiture of Charles, Prince of Wales, citing that Charles would not want to have an aged aunt and uncle there. In the 1960s, the Duke's health deteriorated, and he had operations on an aneurysm and a detached retina. In 1971, the Duke was diagnosed with throat cancer and underwent treatment. The Queen visited the couple in May 1972, and 10 days later, on the 28th of May 1972, David died. His body was returned to Britain, but he was not given a state funeral due to the abdication. David was buried in the Royal Burial Ground at Frogmore. His wife died in 1986 and was also buried alongside him.